let me officially welcome you, Hanna, and welcome our audience to our conversation here, online conversation on understanding the war between Russia and Ukraine. And my name is Amelie Theussen. I work at the Center for War Studies. Have been doing so for a while, and I have the pleasure of, chairing this discussion today and asking you a few questions. Let me really quickly introduce you, Hanna, and then if I forget something about your profile, you can, of course, add to that. But with us, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Hanna Shelest. I've heard she comes straight from the UK Prime Minister cabinet meeting. So we're really happy that you would find the time to be with us today. And you're undoubtedly really busy schedule. And Hanna is the director for security programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism and the editor-in-chief of UA Ukraine Analytica, and also the head of the board of the NGO Promotion of Intercultural Cooperation. Prior to this, I know she served for more than 10 years as a senior researcher at the National Institute for Strategic Studies under the President of Ukraine, Odessa branch. And in 2014, she was a visiting research fellow at the NATO Defense College. And that's something that we have in common, which I'm really excited to hear, because I spent some time there last year and it's such a beautiful environment, I think. So I was very delighted to read that. And as we already chatted about, you're located in Odessa at the moment. So I think that will sort of lead us directly into my first question that we've prepared. For the audience, we're really happy that you could be here. And if you have questions for Hanna, use the chat or the Q&A function, and then I'll make sure to ask Hanna your questions. And we're recording this because we wanted to put it online afterwards. But of course, Hanna, let us know if there's anything you want us to remove from the conversation later on, or things like that. If you say something that you don't want on YouTube, we can make that happen, right? So just so you're aware. All right. My first question to you would be whether you can quickly tell us what the situation on the ground looks like in Ukraine at the moment.
Thank you, Amelie, and thank you for the invitation. It is definitely a great pleasure to be and to talk about what is happening in Ukraine. I would prefer to speak about something more positive, about the, future membership at the NATO or the Black Sea security, how we can build the confidence building measures, but unfortunately, the reason is not so good. However, that also gave us a lot of opportunities to speak about the European security and the regional security and the developments that are happening, because we understand perfectly that what is happening in Ukraine is just the manifestation of that crisis that we have. And that it is not just the Russian-Ukrainian war, it is much wider, because what Ukraine is fighting is both our ability to be a sovereign state and to protect our identity and future, but also that is the ability to defend the European values, something for what we really struggled for the last 8 years since everything started. And here is probably will be my first notion that it's really important to remember that everything started not in February 2022. Everything started in February 2014 when the Russian Federation violated the international law for the first time, annexing the sovereign territory, the Crimean Peninsula, and then initiating the war activities in the east of the country. However, that's probably even being wrong to say that that's when Russia for the first time violated, because a few years before this, in 2008, the same happened in Georgia and previously in Moldova. So we are definitely speaking about the certain pattern of behavior and of the policies that previously we preferred not to notice. And when I say we, I would say that even Ukrainians preferred sometimes to close their eyes because nobody could believe that something like this can happen. The last 43 days, we are fighting the real war in Europe. And I would say that even being specialists in the conflicts and being in many conflict zones for the last 20 years, there are many developments that I observe currently in Ukraine that I haven't seen there. And that is definitely like returning us back to the 19th century or to the Second World War, both in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of the activities and tactics of how the warfare is conducted. So where we are now, first in terms of physical activities, we need to understand that the heaviest warfare being happening on the north and on the east of the country. So we are talking definitely originally about the attempts to capture the capital, Kiev. It didn't happen, and the very heavy fightings and occupation been happening around Chernihiv and all those small towns that became a tragic picture of the news within the last week, Bucha, Irpin, Vorzel, Gostomel. So there were the massacres and atrocities happened. So that being one big theater of warfare. The second being around Sumy and Kharkiv, that is the northeast, and that is really important to understand why Kharkiv. It's not just the second biggest city in the country. It's not just the industrially developed place, but also Kharkiv been perceived as the Russian speaker city and a little bit more pro-Russian back in 2014. And they've been ideas in the Russian plans to occupy it and to make the same as with Donetsk and Lugansk back in 2014. When the US and UK intelligence started giving information in January, they also noticed that Russians are aiming to Kharkiv to become like the new capital or something like this. The reaction of the city was very strong. They were demonstrators saying that, no, we would like to be in Ukraine. We're a Ukrainian city. We are not going to support you or to surrender. So everything that happened after this, we consider as the punishment. Just a punishment of the city with all those heavy destructions and shelling using all the cluster bombs and the long-range missiles against the city. And that is definitely what you're seeing now. It's just not just unprovoked, that's just illogical destructions that you would see there. It's not the military objects, it's just the thousands of houses being deliberately targeted. And Kharkiv is still, as we see, under the Ukrainian control, and the city would be fight. The east became the new focus within the last week when the forces started to withdraw from Kiev. Definitely the fighting started on the east. One of the reasons is that the Russian Federation needs to demonstrate at least some victory, especially before the 9th of May. Kremlin always preferred some symbolic dates. All these 8 years, you can see that some of the increase of the fighting happened exactly to some of the commemorated days in Ukrainian or in Russian history. So that's why they need to show at least something, and occupying of the greater territory on the east would be one of those victories that they can demonstrate. Because if you remember, just 2 days before the open invasion, they recognized so-called independence of the separate districts of Donetsk and Lugansk region. And what is more important, they recognize them not in the current, not even the borders, but frames, let's say, that been for these 8 years, but as the whole administrative territories of Donetsk and Lugansk region. So they are aiming now to occupy at least that. And then it is the south, and the south is the most probably difficult to explain because it is the mix of everything. Mariupol, it is that tragedy of the besieged city that we all know, unfortunately. Mariupol is very important because that allows to connect Russia with occupied Crimea. And the Sea of Azov is seen by Russian as the internal sea. So that part of the Ukrainian coast is important, first of all, because of this connection of the east end of Crimea. When you go to the western part of Crimea, the cities of Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa, that's a different story. Here, the idea is, first of all, to cut Ukraine off from the seaside, from the coast, to make Ukraine not a maritime power anymore. Why that is important, and that is strategic things. First of all, 60% of Ukrainian export is going by sea. 90% of Ukrainian grain export have been going by sea. Is it a lot or not? If you think that Ukraine is in top 3 of the world exporters of grains, first of all, of wheat, of barley, and number 1 exporter of the sunflower oil, you would understand that to cut 90% of our grain export, it means something. And that it means something not only for our economy, but for the food security of the Middle East, of India, of many countries in Asia. For example, Lebanon is receiving 50% of their grain export from Ukraine. Egypt receiving approximately 35% of their exports of grains from Ukraine. Try to imagine in which situation these countries are after pandemic in terms of social and economic. Now you will see, or better say, we already see it. I just talked with the journalists from the Middle East, and they said that the prices for wheat, for grains increased dramatically, and we can see a very serious inflation and the food problems very soon in these countries. The developments already seen. So that's definitely understanding of why that is important, not only for Ukraine, but also Odessa is the base for the Ukrainian Navy. After Ukrainian Navy being kicked off from Crimea in 2014, the Navy headquarters is now in Odessa. And that is important both for the defense, but also the targeting for the Russian Federation. That's in terms of geography. Few things about the change of the tactics that Russians are using. First of all, let's be honest that all of us in January overestimated the Russian power. And it was the idea of the mighty Russian armed forces that can capture Ukraine for 2 days. The phrase of the German Minister of Finance, who said it at the meeting with Ukrainian ambassador, that why should we help you, like in 2 days everything will be finished, you will be captured. That's really shocked us, and as a result you see that we are the day 43 and nobody captured not only Kiev but in general the big territories. But at the same time we should not underestimate the Russian forces, both in terms of the amount of ammunition and the quality of some of their ammunition, also in terms of the number of the personnel they may have. It's definitely not comparable with Ukrainian, and they are using them without the respect to the human lives, so that's why they can behave much more brutally. But still, because the original plan of occupying Ukraine didn't work, that's why the idea being transformed. And now we see for the last few weeks the intensification not of the land operations, but of the missiles and air operations. And Russians are using the long-term, long-range missiles that are starting from 500 kilometers, from 500 to 2,000 kilometers. So in this way, they even don't need to enter the territory of Ukraine, and they have quite a big amount of them, so they're easily using them. Even more, they're using not only their territory, but Belarus, and that is also something important to remember, that from the very first day, Russians attached Belarus to themselves by using their territory, first of all, for the military activities. Still no Belarus military personnel, and that is very important and something that helps us. But at the same time, territory and supplies, that is also very important. With the all these air operations, it is also completely blocked the Black Sea. And when they're blocking the Black Sea, they're blocking not only Ukrainian coast, but with throwing, for example, the old sea mines, they are now disturbing the safety of navigation near the Romanian and Turkish coast as well. So unfortunately, we will have, we already see it if you look at the map, how the commercial navigation being disturbed in the Black Sea region. But with these additional restrictions and such threats, I would say that this problem will continue and can significantly influence the trade of these countries in the Black Sea as well. So I would not speak here about brutalities of what's been happening with the civilian population. You can see that definitely targeting of civilian population became one of the main strategies of the Russian Federation, because the idea being of attacking and surrendering. What didn't happen, luckily, but definitely that is the new reality in which we are now, and which the Ukrainian state need to consider all the times. The last but not the least are the refugees. From 42 million Ukrainian population, according to the current data, we have 4 million of refugees. It means those who traveled abroad. And we have additional 6 million as the internally displaced people. So that is the really tremendous amounts. But what is interesting that for the last few days, we had more people who would like to return to Ukraine rather than to leave Ukraine, according to the border services. Plus, those people who left Kyiv, for example, already many of them are saying that they would like to return back. So those people who have where to return back, and if they consider that it's more or less safe, they express this desire to be back. So that is not the same type of the refugees as you witness from the Middle East, because people have really, they've been predominantly running because of the security issues. And when you see the gender composition, 90% of those who are refugees, that is moms with small kids. So if men, that is predominantly retired, so those who cannot serve in the armed forces, so that is people older than 60 years old, maybe some other like small amount of people with a bad health. But that is definitely a picture, that the picture of Ukrainian refugee, that is not a young man who is searching for the economic benefits, but a woman with a small kids who is just trying to protect. What to do in the future, that is a separate question.
Yes, I understand that was a big one, but maybe we can zoom in on a few of the things that you said. I got a question from the audience about cyber attacks. So you spoke about, you know, targeting civilians as a strategy, right? And these long-range missiles and how sort of the tactics have shifted. But you didn't mention cyber attacks. And the question is in particular that with reference to Crimea. So the war started in 2014, but what was initiated in the preliminary phase in late 2013? So how did Russia use cyber attacks? And maybe, I don't know how much you know about this, but maybe you can put this in context for us also in relation to what is going on now. Because I think more people expected to see more on the cyber front than we actually have seen.
No, there are a lot of happening. It's just that probably in the international media, when you see the pictures of the real warfare and cyber attacks, but show it on TV what has been the cyber attack. That's why we know less about it, I mean, as a general public. You know, the cyber attacks from the very beginning being quite a significant part of the Russian aggression. Late 2013 was probably not the best time. They've been attacks, but at that time it was not the primary activities of the Russian Federation. 2014, starting from spring, that's when we started to see the significant attempts, not only of the DOS attacks, like something classical, but for example, it is very famous case of 2014 when they attacked the critical infrastructure, the energy system of the Western regions, when 10 regions of Ukraine being blacked out. So that was the first big signal that the cyber attacks would be the weapon. After these, for the 8 years, we experienced up to 30,000 of the cyber attacks per year, according to the security services. And we can divide them into several groups. First is the attacks against the critical infrastructure. Mostly we're speaking about the energy sector. The second is the attempts to attack the banking system. Less successful, the National Bank had quite a good system to protect. Attacks against the governmental institutions, so the websites of all ministries, something quite traditional for the cyber attacks. And the fourth group, it is the attacks by the malware through the commercial software. The very famous Petya and non-Petya viruses, if you remember, all this ransom software that been used, and they've been used through the accountant reporting software. So most of the private companies, they had this software for the like tax reporting or something like this, and they found the way how to attack through it, and then the effect being tremendous not only in Ukraine. What we saw later, like that being like traditionally all the time, and that's why Ukraine and NATO even had the NATO Trust Fund for cybersecurity since 2014. That's allowed to create a lot of the mechanisms and centers for emergency response for these threats, and many of other defense and mechanisms in Ukraine. In January 2022, we had a significant attack. It was 17, if I'm not mistaken, of January. It had been an attack against all Ukrainian governmental institutions, agencies, their websites, the National Bank, and many companies. So that being probably one of the biggest attacks for the last few years, predominantly with the DDoS. After these, now we are already also experiencing these cyber attacks. First of all, critical infrastructure. Now we see that critical infrastructure became one of the primary. Then it is the attacks against the governmental websites, because less information you can have officially, the better vacuum you have, and you can spread gossips. Media of Ukraine being targeted significantly by the cyber attacks. That's why most of them created the Telegram channels where they can continue providing information even in case there are difficulties with the website. But also in terms of cyber attacks, you need to understand that it's not only attempt to suppress something, but also the active actions. For example, that is the intervention in not only social networks, that's something traditional that we use, but in the mobile operators, and sending the fake SMS from some governmental structures, for example, or from some fake institution that made people to provide their data there, or to help with the reporting of some things that could be dangerous then for the armed forces. So we definitely see the development of the cyber attacks just from the classical DOS attacks, viruses, malwares, to the active operations in the cybersphere.
Thank you. Maybe we can sort of look at a bit of the whole picture in a way, right? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what does Ukraine need? So, and maybe we can ask that on multiple levels, right? So what does Ukraine need from NATO friends and allies, right? What does NATO need from the other EU countries? But then also maybe on a more personal note, I mean, what can individuals contribute to that is useful to Ukraine at this point?
As today our Minister of Foreign Affairs said, in NATO we need weapons, weapons, and weapons. That would be easy to say, but definitely it's not that simple. Ukraine needs weapons, both defensive and offensive. And I really appreciated today the phrase of the NATO Secretary General, who said that there is no any more defensive and offensive weapons because Ukraine is defending itself. So all weapons will be used for defense. That is true. The tanks are not just to attack. We're not crossing the borders with the Russian Federation. We're using tanks to protect the forces and to advance for liberation of the territory that been under the occupation now. So what Ukraine needs is, first of all, everything that can help with the air defense. We're speaking about air defense, anti-missile systems, radars. Why that is important, as I explained, the tactics change. That's what Russians are using mostly. We need the anti-ship missiles as well, because the last weeks we started to see that Russians are using more and more the missiles that are stationed at their ships, that they are not even coming to our territorial waters, just shelling from 20 miles, let's say, from the shore. And that's where Ukraine is really lacking capabilities. Then Ukraine needs the ammunition, because we can have sufficient amount of the, let's say, air defense systems or anti-tank systems, but considering the intensity of activities, you always need the additional supply of the ammunition. Tanks will be helpful as well, especially those Soviet-type tanks that are still available in the NATO member states, because we know how to operate them. Aircrafts. Our air forces being not in the very good condition, we were not modernizing them. Like it was just impossible to modernize everything, yep, so at once, and airplanes are usually expensive. That's why we definitely need additional airplanes that can be used by the Ukrainian air forces to protect the territories. We need the support with the critical infrastructure. We already discussed about joint cyber operations. We already discussing the opportunities to have either no-fly zone or some other type of protection near the nuclear plants. Don't forget that Ukraine has 15 nuclear reactors in Ukraine. Chernobyl, we already saw what's happened when Russians occupied it. As for now, Chernobyl is liberated. Still, we need to check that everything is in the good condition, because there have been military actions at the territory. but Zaporizhia nuclear plant is under occupation of the Russian Federation. Considering that they've been shelling and having military activities just at the territory of the plant, it is like a grenade without the stopper. You never know what can happen there. But there is others, Khmelnytsky and Yuzhno-Ukrainsk and many others. And as for now, we are trying to protect them, but considering how Russia is shelling without checking where, that is under the danger. We need the patrolling of the Black Sea, as for my opinion, because we see that Russian Federation is definitely developing the maritime activities over there, trying to control the whole sea. So if we would like to have the safety of navigation, we need the NATO ships involvement there, especially considering the 3 NATO states are literal states. So you have a right to do it. It's not assistance to Ukraine. That is, first of all, assistance to the NATO member state. In terms of economic and social development, we obviously need to think about the reconstruction fund for Ukraine. So that is something to consider, that we would immediately start as soon as the hostilities are over. You saw the devastating pictures of the towns around Kiev and Kiev itself, Kharkiv. That is tremendous amounts of money that we would need to reconstructing the infrastructure, the housing for people, and that's where Ukraine, just with our budget, would not be able to cope. If you would like Ukrainian people to return back as refugees, they need to have a place where to return. And Ukraine would need investments in the economy, so to boost it after this. For now, we are trying to cope as much as possible in those spheres where we can, but many enterprises also had the difficulties because Russians just either destroyed them or stopped, so that these investments and help would be needed. And sanctions, it's very important because sanctions is not just the political solidarity that you are demonstrating. And I understand that some countries are saying how difficult it is to apply because that can touch the well-being of their Europeans. And maybe I'm very cynical, but usually I'm answering like, you're paying now this price because you didn't want to pay it for the previous 8 years. You preferred not to notice the Russian developments of their policies and their statements. So now you're definitely paying the price for this. We are talking about additional financial sanctions. We're talking about additional sanctions for the energy sector. Luckily today, finally, the adoption of the sanction that limits Russian ships entering to the ports, that's important. But we need to think more, because one of the problems is that many European countries prefer to avoid the sanctions. I mean, on paper, we have good sanctions, and then we find out that, for example, France and Germany was selling weapons to Russia from 2015 to 2020. So how it's possible, you know, and that is just one example. And unfortunately, we are now making the list of those who try to avoid the sanction and how it is done. So it's not just Ashan who would prefer to stay and to have business as a supermarket. That's much more serious attempts to avoid or to, especially in terms of financial and banking system, energy and military industry. So that should be under the control. And as the individual, that's always an option to help. It depends like what is your priority. There are plenty of local NGOs, charity foundations who are helping just particular towns, and that is important because sometimes when you give it to UNICEF or Red Cross, you're spending plenty of money for the administrative costs rather than of what is on the ground. And for example, with Red Cross, we have huge problems. Ukrainians are complaining a lot because we haven't seen them initially. We know that billions of dollars went to their budget, but nothing on the ground that much. And the same with UNICEF. Sorry, we haven't seen anybody with the UNICEF logo in Ukraine as for now, but we know how much money being spent for them and given to them to help Ukrainian kids, for example. So that's also the issues that we need to consider, that try to find a local foundation that you really see the activities, what they are doing. Or you can use Ukrainian governmental accounts, because National Bank created separate accounts to help military, to help kids, to help for infrastructure, to help humanitarian. So they made it, you can decide where to spend. So that is a special account where you sure that this money also being spent exactly in Ukraine.
Great. So there are some options if somebody now feels obliged or inspired to help a little bit on a personal level. Then I think you gave us very good ideas of where to look if we wanted to help. I want to talk also about President Zelenskyy and his leadership, because I think that's something that stands out, at least from a Danish perspective, that he's been doing maybe also surprisingly well in terms of his leadership in this war, right? And I've at least read reports about him not being super popular maybe before, but now, you know, really stepping up in his function as a president. So I was wondering whether you could say a few words about sort of his role in this, and also his outreach and engagement with other countries, because I know he's been speaking pretty much to everybody that matters these days, right?
Yes, that's true. Let's be honest that just before the war, the President Zelenskyy rating really fell down, and that's been connected with a lot of the corruption scandals, even that his agenda when he's been campaigning for the president being to fight corruption. But during the 2 years, the situation appeared not so good. Both that people around him allowed corruption, but also because some of the people around him been disturbing the reforms in terms of fighting corruption with the anti-corruption institutions and so on. So there were a lot of questions towards him in terms of what he'd been doing, what he'd been promising. The war demonstrated a lot of the good qualities within him. Honestly, most of people in Ukraine didn't expect him to be that strong and really taking the leadership. According to the constitution, Ukrainian president is responsible for the foreign policy and defense. That's something President Zelenskyy been neglecting 2 years before. So, I mean, the first 2 years of his presidency. And now he stepped exactly where he should be, meeting the leaders, talking to the foreign parliaments, talking about the military support and being on the ground. That's important, and that's raised his ratings of support tremendously, more than 90%. But at the same time, we need to understand that such a high ratings, that is something temporarily. And it doesn't mean that if tomorrow the war is over, his ratings will be the same high when he would return to the economic and social issues. That first. The second issue is that the current negotiations that are happening about the possible peace agreements, that's also raised quite a number of questions around him and people around him. Because first of all, the delegation that we see at the Russian-Ukrainian talks, some people there are quite suspicious, let's be honest, and that's raised a lot of questions from the opposition, from the experts, what they're doing there, what will be the results of these negotiations. Will they be tactical agreements or the strategic? So he understands the strategic risks over there. And in case the agreement will be dubious, his ratings can fall. And that is maybe one of the important things to understand about Ukrainians. We, especially comparing to Russians, we never had Tsar. We never had a king. So we never had this image of the leader that should not be questionable, even in times of war. We can elect a person with 73% of support, and in 2 weeks to say that you are wrong and get out. That's been historically. You can see the 17th, 18th centuries. It's always been like this in Ukraine. So that's why one day we can have a very strong support, but in case he's making bad decisions, Ukrainians can be immediately against him. So that's why we're very critical about any type of the leadership. Also, the last week we saw few not very good developments that have been covered under the banner of war necessity, but that's also raised a lot of questions for the Ukrainian society, and that's what we are talking and not being afraid of. First is his behavior with media. From the very first day, all our media channels united to have the single marathon. So they are mostly providing the same news. Just the anchors are changing, so all their TV channels are showing the same. But we also have several TV channels, some of them affiliated with the ex-president Poroshenko, for example. They're extremely patriotic. They're giving all the same information, but they're with their separate highlighting 2 days ago, the state operator decided to switch them off from the ability to transmit their signal. So they're now just in the internet. The journalists and the society have been extremely angry because that is not one necessity. You're not cutting off the pro-Russian TV channels. You just cut off the TV channels of your opposition because you understand that these people are raising questions, for example, about NATO membership, and you are talking about neutrality. So that's why we're critical to Mr. Zelenskyy sometimes as well. Or the second issue is with the independent international board members of our big companies, state companies. Also, there are some decisions taken that are explained by the war necessity that some people think that can be bad in terms of our anti-corruption warfare. So that's why the picture is very diverse. In terms of military, in terms of foreign policy, no questions as for now. In terms of future NATO membership or the media freedom, there are some questions that we are definitely raising now. And we hope that that would not be a trend, that it is just the exceptions rather than news for us. So that's why, let's see, President Zelenskyy is important, but it's also important to follow what the people around him are doing.
Of course, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I really enjoyed that very sort of nuanced assessment. Thank you for that. Maybe you already mentioned the negotiations a little bit, so maybe we can dive into that a little bit further as well. Because I wanted to ask you about your view on the role of diplomacy, the role of these negotiations, sort of both the opportunities, but also the severe limitations that lie in this, right? So what's your assessment? Is there hope for a negotiated settlement? Is there something the international community can contribute to making this better, more likely, more, you know, of a more realistic scenario that will actually lead to something? Or is all hope lost anyway?
No, the negotiations is a very complicated issue because of many reasons. Originally, Ukraine is definitely always pro-diplomacy, and we tried to stick to diplomatic negotiations all these years with the Minsk group, with the Normandy format, now with these direct bilateral talks, Turkish some kind of mediation. So Ukraine never rejected negotiations because we were not planning to fight with the military. At the same time, we need to understand several things. First is that Russia is using negotiations as a possibility just to manipulate with their position and their ultimatums to Ukraine, especially at the very first stage of these negotiations. The second thing that the composition of delegations, honestly, they look strange because when the two ministers of foreign affairs met in Antalya a week ago or something, Russian minister said that that is not his responsibility to speak about ceasefire or something like this. And that really looks odd because who, as not the Minister of Foreign Affairs, can negotiate? So then you see who is at these bilateral talks, that is people with a completely different position, like the advisor to the head of the office of the president from the Russian side, who is leading these negotiations. That looks a little bit strange because you understand that person who is at the negotiation should have some authority, should have some right to promise something. That's definitely demonstrate the situation within Russia that Putin is not trusting in anybody and only his inner circle. That's why he preferred to send a delegation like this. But that's also make the composition from the Ukrainian side a little bit odd because why the member of the parliament is leading the delegation, for example, not the ministers. Like it is not in his capacity, it's just that president is giving him this power for the negotiations. So that's why I'm quite careful about these negotiation groups, because it is always a chance that any of the sides can say that, oh, sorry, but somebody else needs to decide. We could just to discuss. The second problem that I have definitely is with the conditions that we hear now about the possible conditions for the peace agreement. And we understand that maybe parties need to go for the compromises, but we need to understand that these compromises should not jeopardize the future security. And there are issues to compromise, there are issues not to compromise. For example, territorial integrity of Ukraine, why we should compromise it if we used to have it for so many years and we haven't took anybody else's territory. For example, the NATO membership and this neutrality issue, that's something what really struck me. Regionally, it could sound like, oh, that's so easy, like just give up, become neutral state and know where to your territory. But you need to remember that in 2014, Ukraine already was neutral. It was called in our strategic document as a non-bloc status, but de facto bloc is only NATO, no other organization been called like this. So we were no non-bloc status. It didn't prevent the Russian Federation from occupying and annexing Crimea. That's first, that you always need to remember that it's not just that we don't want to be neutral, it's just proved to be inefficient. The second is that Ukrainian delegation is saying that we are searching for the better security guarantees. That okay, if not NATO, but we need to have from the individual member states the agreement that will be better than Article 5 of NATO. That is the problem. That is a big problem with this, because you have just, how to say it, first of all, nobody from these countries are promising this. Even the United Kingdom or United States, who are the biggest partners and allies of Ukraine now, they said that no, Article 5 is only for NATO. Collective defense is only if you're within NATO. Nobody's saying that they're ready to fight instead of us or for us. Yeah, so giving military support, that's what we have now. That's not something that the new agreement can change. But also try to imagine China as the security guarantor of Ukraine, or Israel, or even Turkey. I can't imagine it, because even now the position of these countries is not so easy and not so single thought about this. Or Germany, if Germany were rejecting to sell weapons for all these 8 years, can you imagine suddenly Germany to decide to implement the no-fly zone or something like this? And even the Russian Federation, that would be the equal in these security guarantees. So it seems to me that Ukraine should be a little bit more realistic, first of all. Long-term thinker in terms of asking what we would like to have at the negotiations, and to think not only about the immediate peace, but about long-term consequences, how not to have the same as Dayton made for Bosnia, when we thought that it would be ideal peace agreement, but then we started to have even bigger problems because we put in this agreement a lot of the things that would jeopardize security.
So, and I don't know if you can answer this at all, but where do you see sort of the biggest likelihood for a potential agreement to be reached? Like, what would that look like? What does the future ideally look like?
No, there are more and more experts in Ukraine who are saying that the real outcome of this war is not at the negotiating table, but at the field. Because positions of the Russian Federation depends on the advancement of the Ukrainian armed forces. That's in most of the conflicts for sure, but here especially, because if you follow how their demands been changing from the day 1 to day 43, we see the real possibility for the changes. Because originally the statements being made in such a way that they wanted everything and Ukraine need just to surrender. In few days, the text was that, yeah, the leadership of Ukraine doesn't want compromises, so let's call the armed forces to arrest maybe Mr. Zelenskyy, to take power in their hands, and we will negotiate. When they saw how Ukrainian armed forces been fighting, immediately being the understanding that definitely they would not surrender or oppose. Then we started to see next proposals, softer and softer. The reason the Russian forces were not advancing, Ukrainian forces appeared much more resistant than expected. And now we have even the counterattack at some of the directions. So that's definitely make Ukraine in more beneficial position as for now for the negotiations. It seems to me that if Ukraine will be able to continue for some time with the same advancement, and if Ukraine is able to prevent Russians from advancing on the east, that would influence significantly those negotiations that are happening now in Istanbul and online.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that assessment. Maybe as a last question, because I don't want to take more of your time than what we agreed upon, even though this is very interesting, I find. What are we missing? Because, you know, we get this coverage from the Western media, right? And we see, you know, these reports that are in the newspapers, we get expert opinions and things like that. But is there anything you find that of the things that we have discussed today, but also of the things that you see reflected in Western NATO members' media and things like that, is there anything that's missing from the conversation that you find very important?
Probably two things, because there are many things that can be missed, but more in the details, but two important things. First of all, it is an attempt to justify the Russian population and to blame only Mr. Putin or few people around him. I also would like to believe in the Russian people conscious, but both the statistics and the actions describe completely different picture. We need to understand that the Russian population, unfortunately, supports this course of actions by the Russian leadership. That the atrocities on the ground are done not by Mr. Putin, but by the regular soldiers. And if you see the pictures of how they behaved in the houses in Bucha, I'm not even speaking about the killings and rapes, just a regular behavior in the houses that they've been living for these few weeks. You would understand that that is not the commander who made you to do this. That is your personal choices. The looting is your personal choices, and that's what we are witnessing now. So the same with the Russian academicians. A lot of universities around Europe are now making the programs for the Russian academics who would like to escape the country. But sometimes you need to check that most of these people being perfectly okay with the Russian occupation of Crimea, or they've been excusing the Russian actions, and now they're running just because the economic situation is becoming more difficult. So it seems to me that now, after 40 days, we have sufficient amount of evidences that you cannot separate Russian people from the Russian president. They not only elected him, but many of them supported the actions while the economy was okay. The second issue is probably understanding that what Ukraine is fighting now, we are fighting not only our own independence, that Russia is trying to jeopardize the whole European security. So when you're providing support in economic or military terms to Ukraine, it is just as you're protecting yourself as well, because the next target can be any of the other, especially neighboring countries. And it's not that we are trying to frighten you, for sure, or to panic, but you already heard the statements from the ex-president Medvedev, from President Putin himself, from many people in their parliament who openly threaten Poland, Estonia, Sweden. So we also thought in 2014 that that is only threats, that only few crazy politicians who are talking about this. De facto, you see that the words were very close to the actions. That's why it's better to support Ukraine now, understanding that you're supporting yourself, so that you are defending yourself as well. And I see the question over here very briefly to reply to it, that is this where the first hybrid war, or is it mostly fought with conventional means? First of all, the first hybrid warfare being as old as the ancient Greeks. So Russians just use it very operational. But the second is that we need to understand hybrid warfare is not information or cyber warfare. It's hybrid because you have both conventional warfare and unconventional. Without this conventional component, all others will be just information operation or the cyber attack. But only because you have all of this at the same time, that's becoming hybrid. So in this way, this war is still hybrid, because Russia is still using very actively information operations, both against Ukraine and against many of the European countries. We have wonderful researchers about this. Then they have cyber attacks, not only against Ukraine, but against a lot of the European countries. You have the spy operation, you have energy war. Look at what's been happening in the energy sector and the blackmailing of many European countries with the energy. So that's why, and church we didn't have time to speak about it, but the Russian church being one of the arms of their warfare now against many countries with the orthodoxy in Europe. So that's why that is definitely still a hybrid warfare. It's just that now the military component is more evident and active rather than others, but it doesn't mean that it's just to everything in the conventional warfare.
Great, thanks for answering the question as well. Maybe we have, I think, about 2 minutes left before I want to thank you, but I'm really intrigued by this role of the church. So maybe you can just spend 2 more minutes explaining what role the church actually plays.
First of all, you need to remember that the Russian Orthodox Church always been very close with the Russian government. That is not the allegation. Those who are interested find wonderful researchers, and the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church is the former KGB agent with the personal contact with Mr. Putin, and they've always been involved. Since 2014, they started to be involved actively. For example, their church has been providing their territory for the military units to be there and to use them for the missile attacks on the east of Ukraine. Russian Orthodox Church also played a lot with the other Orthodox Church, especially in Greece, in Cyprus, in Serbia, in Armenia, in Moldova, because them being under their influence, financial influence, and it's not even doctrinal, because it's been not about the religious issues. It was more about money and power, property, rather than about any religious disputes. The situation became even worse when Ukraine started all this process for receiving the independence of the church. The Russian Orthodox Church started to be more active in their politics. Also, in many places, it was not only direct connection between the church and politicians, but for example, in Ukraine before 2014, priests can be members of the city councils, original councils. So they've been directly involved in the politics, and mostly they've been with the pro-Russian political parties. But the last but not the least, it is propaganda, because we know that in many of these countries, the priests are quite influential in their local communities. And we already have plenty of reportings about Russian Orthodox Church in Russia, for example, just in their daily pranks, prank the actions of the Russian armed forces, or bringing people the information that they need to clean Ukraine from Ukrainians or something like this. So all these rhetoric, repeating what is in the news and from the politician, the church is doing the same, being actively involved in these propaganda activities. So there are definitely plenty of examples of the research about these issues in some of the countries. They will be coming more, it seems to me, soon, because I know several organizations who are dealing with these. And very often you need to understand that that is not a religious conflict, for example, between Ukrainian and Russian church, because doctrinal, they're the same. The question is exactly in terms of the political influence and support of the military, because this support just put the pictures and photos when the priest is coming to the military base, and I don't know what is the like baptizing ceremony. Yep, we have this like ceremony for the tank or to the missile. Sorry, but that is not what church is made for. But unfortunately, these activities are happening, and they are not individual cases, but quite a massive around the Russian Orthodox Church. All
right. Well, at this point, let me just thank you again for joining us, Hanna, for this really, really interesting conversation. I certainly learned a lot. And I wanted to thank our audience for being here. And I also wanted to thank my colleague Claire for putting us in touch and actually making this possible. So thank you so much, and have a nice afternoon, evening, and all the best to you. I hope you stay safe and your loved ones as well. Thank you for joining
the invitation.